What's the biggest hindrance to a free-thinking mind? The palatable yet bitter solution to the thirst of polishing your own thoughts? The comfort of an echo chamber, a quick fix for a deep, entangled issue? We find ourselves trapped in these chambers, convinced we're thinking freely, when in reality all we're doing is just recycling the same thoughts, the same pain, like we're quenching our thirst with a slow-working poison, a quick and sad solution to a more complex and deeply rooted issue. The irony is that in a world full of options, we often choose the easiest path, seeking refuge in quick fixes, thoughtless thoughts, and a herd we can call home, sometimes rationalising the irrational, drinking salt water in a world of choice. My point isn't to attack the downtrodden of society, the ones who have been dealt a mentally bad hand. This is why I try put an emphasis on the fact that in some cases, this phenomenon doesn't even translate. The phenomenon of finding comfort in the box of broken minds. The mental health box. The thought process of, I also am sad and anxious. Let's unite through these similarities. This is both an understandable yet twisted reality that unravels. Yes, a community built on shared experiences, but experiences rooted in brokenness. This sense of community is something we humans crave, a natural foundation within our minds. We see this through things like politics, music, religion, or even mental health struggles. We find these groups through individual sets of circumstances. They offer us something primal, unification, belonging, a place to call home. But in the rush to belong, we can find ourselves stuck, fixed into immovable, pessimistic positions. Some have such a strong desire for community that even the community of being clinically depressed becomes appealing. Most people don't desire to be sad, but almost everyone desires a sense of belonging. Most people have at the very least heard of a man named Carl Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist, psychotherapist and psychologist who was born on the 26th of July 1875. He was a profound thinker, a man who revolutionised and laid out a new and unique way of understanding the human psyche, expanding on the way in which our minds function. He conjured up a concept known as the 12 Jungian Archetypes, a concept that branches off of one of his other main theories, the collective unconscious, an idea that describes the human mind like a sponge, passed down and inherited from our earliest ancestors, a storehouse of memories, deep-seated beliefs and instincts, soaked up and wringed out into our genetic code. These traits and beliefs absorbed by the sponge of our ancestors help to make up the 12 Jungian archetypes. These archetypes are universal, woven into each and every one of us. Each one of us carries pieces of these timeless characters, whether it's the hero trying to prove their worth, or the artist driven by a thirst for creation. These archetypes pop up across all different civilizations and cultures. They exist like ancient myths, still speaking to us today. Old stories with characters that symbolise our inner struggles and desires, quietly guiding the way we think, feel and act. We may not always notice them, but they form the foundation of how we see both the world and ourselves. As life progresses and our experiences broaden, only a few of these archetypes begin to dominate our personalities and ideas. The best example of an archetype would be the hero, the one who strives to demonstrate value through bold actions, one who's driven by a fear of appearing weak or vulnerable, their main goal being to validate self-worth through brave deeds, all while simultaneously fearing any display of weakness or vulnerability. Another one is the jester, one who welcomes joy and humour, a joker driven by a fear of boredom or being boring to others, the one whose strategy involves the indulgence of play, jokes and humour, all while having an overarching lack of true purpose or value. But how exactly does this correlate? That's where the everyman comes into play, also known as the commoner. This is an archetype that is fixed on the need to belong, an embodiment of the word itself, A character that can be shaped by feelings of abandonment and naivety. Someone lost yet eager to find their place in the world, to be understood and accepted. According to Jung, each archetype also has a shadow that represents a struggle to be overcome. This is where we find the darker side of the archetype, the side of someone who has felt abandoned for so long that they'll seek community anywhere, a follower of the masses, one that rests in places that thrive on despair. The everyman, in their desperate search for acceptance, can end up finding solace in the mental health box, a place where community is built not on healing, but on shared sadness, anxiety and brokenness, a place where people gather to unite, not in the pursuit of growth, but in the comfort of collective suffering. We see it all around us today, with social media skyrocketing this effect. Platforms like TikTok, Twitter and Reddit housing virtual safe spaces, places where struggling individuals can gather, not to rise above their problems, but to marinate in them. Algorithms help strengthen these communities, feeding us content that confirms our pain instead of challenging us to heal, like a cave of dead air, disguising itself as comforting and supportive. It's a twisted reality, understandable yet tragic. The need to belong is so deeply human, so fundamentally necessary, that a home filled with sadness and sorrows is still considered a home. The commoner still feels a kinship, still rationalising the irrational. We are the same, they think. We are broken together, they say. And it's true, this is a community of like-minded individuals, an echo chamber in its purest form, a warehouse of thoughts where the walls are made of shared wounds, where every voice simply bounces off another, reinforcing the very pain that brought them together. It's the everyman's way of quenching their thirst, a gulp of salt water each day, finding brief comfort in something that only deepens the thirst. So how would you drop this habit? How would you rekindle the flame of moving on? That's where Carl Jung's concept of individuation comes into play. The process of becoming whole, removing the blinders and revealing the flaws in this kind of community. The flaws being that while a place like this offers a temporary refuge, it halts the commoner's journey towards self-awareness and healing. Instead of growing beyond their wounds, the orphan remains stuck, defined by these traits. The way out is not easy, but it's simple. To seek communities beyond the mirror of pain, to find places that challenge you to rise. Desperation for belonging shouldn't end up leading to the acceptance of validating your suffering. Instead, it's about finding people, spaces and conversations that push you, circles that refuse to let you stay broken. This path obviously isn't without risk. It can harbour rejection, but also peace. A much harder road to walk, but the only one that will ever lead to healing, putting an end to the shared goal of misery. From the words of Carl Jung himself, it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself, who is man's greatest danger, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural disasters. In recent years, the push for mental health awareness has been heard loud and clear. We see and hear about it everywhere, from ads to charities to teaching curriculums. It and the speech that surrounds it has integrated itself deeply into our society and social framework. The world has been alerted to the cause. At first glance, this sounds beautiful, a step in the right direction, and in many ways, it is. An issue such as this one being broadcasted far and wide will, without a doubt, reach the right target audience, the truly suffering ones, leading to a surge of genuine problems being addressed, like the flick of a light switch, illuminating the grounds of our minds. It lifts the blinders, letting us see the impurities and unclean habits that previously hid in the dark. Again, a positive outcome. But under this new light of revelation, we also find the worried well, a term coined by the American physician Sidney Garfield. a term that describes those who fall into a state of illusion, those who are not truly ill, but in the swirl of awareness become preoccupied with their mental state, becoming hyper-aware of the mind, second-guessing their thoughts and feelings, making mountains out of molehills, drawn to every tiny speck of dust that's been highlighted by the light of the media, treating nerves as an anxiety disorder, sadness as depression, observing the natural human condition as dysfunctional or freakish. A well-meant movement with tragic ramifications. In the pursuit of solving man's biggest threat, we have inadvertently cast a wide net, additionally catching those who are simply human, experiencing the ups and downs of life. A perfect example of this is depression. In the hunt for mental health advocacy, we've widened the scope, broadening the signs of what counts as depression. Jerome Wakefield and Mark Schmitz pointed this out in their study, titled The Overdiagnosis of Depression in the General Population. Within this study, they found that nearly 2/3 of individuals diagnosed with depression did not actually meet the clinical criteria for major depressive disorder. This 2/3 of people in different times would have been considered simply going through a rough patch, a hard week, maybe even a year of trials, someone faced with the inevitable curveballs of life. But instead, they were diagnosed with clinical depression. About 38.4% of these diagnoses were false positives, where individuals didn't show enough symptoms to warrant such a label. And additionally, when you add in those whose symptoms didn't last long enough, that number balloons to 64%. Think about that for a moment. Almost 2/3 of people who were labelled as depressed were not, by clinical standards, actually suffering from depression. They were in many ways just a part of the worried well community, the ones who mistake the normal fluctuations of life for something deeper, darker and irreparable. This is a tough pill to swallow, and to be perfectly clear, isn't a critique of those types of people. After all, in a world where the overarching message is that mental health matters, it's easy to second guess your emotional state, to feel dysfunctional as a run-of-the-mill human being. That's where lines become blurred, where the worried well join hands with the truly broken, becoming trapped in the mental health box, reinforcing their belief that they too need fixing. What if in their eagerness to seek a solution, they've instead been caught in the web of overdiagnosis, captivity and groupthink? What if that's the real root to their problem? In the aftermath of World War II, Europe was at an all-time low. A place fractured by trauma, anger and guilt. Germany had attacked the world and paid the price. In the autumn of 1945, the city of Dresden was reduced to rubble. Berlin, the capital, was left unrecognisable after being subjected to 363 air raids. The people were left in ruins. Yet despite this, even amongst the devastation, a ragged group of actors gathered, filling the ruins of a bombed-out theatre. It was rough. The audience supposedly had to climb over the ruins of the theatre, passing through a dark tunnel to reach an open-air auditorium, its ceiling practically non-existent, shredded away by air raids. The smell of death was rising through the rubble below them. A German writer named Wolf von Eckart described the actors themselves as haggard, starved, and in genuine rags. Many of the actors had only just been released from the concentration camp. They sang not well, but free. This was more than just a performance, it was a raw and somehow comforting reflection of the city itself. A society crushed and crumbled, stripped bare and left broken, yet somehow still trying to piece itself back together. Throwing humour into the melting pot of cynical soup. That year, the Threepenny Opera was a mirror for people to stare at, reflecting everything with an additional dose of joy and comfort. It was a satirical play built around the plot of a corrupt capitalist society, showcasing the social decay found within it. This concept hit home in the ruins of post-war Berlin. The creator's style behind this play painted a picture of a dark and cynical world, with an interestingly humorous spin to it. It showcased a society where justice and morality are bought and sold, a society infested with corruption and profits. This concept had never felt more relevant. The city had triggered the worst of humanity, yet also seen the worst of humanity. But now through art and comedy, the trauma, guilt and anger was being processed, dealing with it in the only way it could be dealt with, by confronting it head on, finding a light in the darkest of holes, laughter tinged with pain, yet laughter nonetheless. The humour had a dark sharpness to it, but the edges were dulled, not intended to wound or leave unnecessary marks. This satirical style of comedy became crucial, going way beyond just entertainment. It became a tool, a psychological strategy for survival, and we can still see this style of comedy today, albeit under different circumstances with unknown motives behind said thing, but it's still there. Some may consider it an echo chamber in and of itself, a herd mind of dark-humoured risk-takers seeking to offend, in a constant dice roll between laughter and anger. And in some sense I can understand this. I am even in favour of it. Obviously conditions have to be met, but the point still stands. An example could be to point out the past inequalities between certain races. During the Jim Crow era, there was a legal separation of ethnic groups, a major contrast to the world we see today. Back then, a race of people were enslaved and worked to death, bred notably for strength in order to produce strong workers. Now look at them. Once equal opportunity was granted, they dominated in certain sports. African Americans now make up 73% of the NBA and 53% of the NFL. Some might consider this a funny one-up on the white man. The potential for a light-hearted joke or poke here is clear. Under the right conditions and motives, this style of breaking past historical trauma, guilt or frustration is perfect and can be applied to everyone. No one is exempt. The process of alleviating stress through satirical truth is healthy. In the psychological world, there's a term known as cognitive reappraisal, a mental technique that sits at the cornerstone of cognitive behavioural therapy, the mental practice of training yourself to interpret negative situations in a much more positive light. Like a lock and key, humour beautifully aligns with this mechanism, giving individuals the capacity to reframe their circumstances, seeing them through a new and improved comedic lens. A study published in Psychological Science shows that individuals who use humour to reappraise a stressful event experienced a 35% improvement in mood compared to those who don't. It provides an outlet for truth-telling, while simultaneously disarming tension. This comedic change can transform a situation, remodeling a time that once symbolised injustice or defeat into a new era of empowerment and positivity. Research from the Journal of Neuroscience confirms this hardwired coping system that we have in our minds, showing us that laughter not only triggers the release of endorphins in the short term, but it's also long-lasting, an intrinsic buffer against the negative effects of stress and despair. Laughter is quite literally an essential ingredient in maintaining psychological well-being. This study by the Journal of Neuroscience highlights that laughter causes a 20% increase in endorphin levels, contributing to an enhanced ability to handle stress, and in a lot of instances, even physical pain. The power in comedy is monumental, but obviously this analysis isn't the be-all and end-all. A large percentage of people who are truly suffering don't exactly fall into this echo chamber of being broken. But as the paradox of increased mental health awareness persists, we must take this into consideration and ask ourselves, where exactly do we draw the line between healthy introspection and the overthinking of our struggles? It's important to hone in on and validate real suffering, but a growing cultural trend can be seen taking shape. A trend that involves the encouragement and embracing of dysfunction, integrating this brokenness into the form of identity, a badge of honour to some. It's a delicate balance between helping and hurting. Conversations about mental health help to break down the stigma, being a voice for something that has historically been silenced. But on the other hand, there's a risk of normalisation, conversations that lead to the glorification of suffering, where seeking help becomes secondary to embracing the struggle itself. In my opinion, awareness is necessary, even beneficial, but it doesn't lay at the very root of true healing. At the true root of healing lies the idea of reinterpretation, humour, and acceptance, twisting the fabricated fabric of reality until that twist holds, reshaping the way in which we see ourselves. As mentioned at the start, in a world full of choices, we often opt for what we believe is the least painful in the moment, blinded to the most obvious, primitive, and human answer: to laugh in the face of pain.